Good evening, folks. Welcome to our webinar. Thanks for joining me this evening. As always, I appreciate your company. And as always, I will appreciate if you tell me if this stream is okay or if there's something wrong with it. It's a little rainy outside this evening. I think it's drizzling a bit, so it might get a little noisy, but it's not too bad at the moment. So I just want to explain. Well, this evening, I decided to talk a little bit about the millennium. And the reason why I'm doing this is because there's one of us in particular, Brother Florian, who has had some questions relating to the millennium and the events that are described in some places in the Old Testament. And I would like to just spend a little time talking about it. I know it's a touchy subject. I know there are different ideas, but what I would like to do is to share my perspective, look at the biblical reason for it, and hope that what I'm going to say will make sense to those of you who are listening in. As I said, if there are any problems with the feed, like the audio or the picture, then just leave me a little note in the chat box, and I will see what I can do to fix it. Last time we were streaming at about 500 kilobits, and there were some problems. So this evening I've dropped it down to all right, thanks Florian, I got the message. This evening I've dropped it down to 300, and I hope that will be okay. Now, with respect to the millennium, there are at least two major understandings of the millennium, and within those two understandings you have different subheadings, subtopics, sub-ideas. The two main ideas are that, first of all, the millennium is going to be spent on this earth, and the other one is that the millennium is going to be spent in heaven. Just to give a little background, first of all, most people who study the Bible believe that the millennium will be the 7,000th year of this world's history. The reason for this thinking is because when you go to the Old Testament and you look at the rituals and the ceremonies that were laid out in the law, you find that many of them have cycles of 7. For example, the Jubilees, they were supposed to be, the year of Jubilee was supposed to be after 7 cycles of 7. Then at the end of those 7 cycles of 7, liberty was to be proclaimed through all the land. Every slave was to go free. Land was to be restored to the rightful owner. So you had cycles of 7. Every 7th year, the land was supposed to rest. For 1 year, there was to be no planting, no reaping. Everything was just to be left the way it was, to grow wild in the 7th year. Even from the beginning of this world's history, God set up a cycle of 7. There were 6 days in which he created the world, and then on the 7th day he rested. So with all of these cycles, most people who study them come to the conclusion that they are a pattern of how God deals with life on this planet. So if you study biblical chronology, and if you believe it, as I do, you will see that the world is approximately 6,000 years old, based on biblical chronology. I actually did a study of it myself, and from my calculations, the 6,000th year would have been last year. I am aware that you can't be perfect, you can't be exact, because the Bible gives you rounded numbers. It says David reigned for 40 years. It says Solomon reigned for 40 years. Maybe it was 40 years and 3 months. Maybe it was 2 months less than 40 years. But we have these rounded numbers. So when you start calculating, you're not going to be exact, but you can get a rough idea. And when I went through, I ended up with 2016. So that makes me believe that we are somewhere pretty close to the end of the 6,000th year. So based on the this cycle of seven. We believe that the 7,000 year is going to be a time of rest, a time of peace, and in fact, the Bible does speak about such a time in Revelation chapter 20. And we're going to begin by just reading some parts of that passage. Let me just see what you're saying here, Florian. You should make a minute max, maybe. I'm not sure what that means, Florian. I'm not sure. Maybe you can explain a little better. But anyway, I'm going to the passage in Revelation, and I'm going to ask us to read it. Or I'm going to read it, and you probably can follow with me. Revelation 20. Right, here's what it says. And I saw an angel come down from heaven, having the key of the bottomless pit and a great chain in his hand. All right, thanks, Janos. Okay, I understand now. Yes, it's hard to say, to give a margin of error, to say, well, then it's accurate within 10 years or 20 years. I would still be guessing. I'm not really good enough at maths to calculate how much I might possibly be wrong by going through all those dates. But I guess I could be out a few years, but I think it would balance out, because some of the dates would be a little shorter and some would be a little longer. So it would basically average out, but nobody could know for certain. It's going to be pretty close, I believe, but not exact. And that's the best I can say. So let's go to Revelation 20. Here is where we have the foundation idea for 1,000 years, for a millennium of rest and of peace. And it says, and I saw an angel come down from heaven, having the key of the bottomless pit and a great chain in his hand. And he laid hold on the dragon, that old serpent which is the devil and Satan, and bound him 1,000 years, and cast him into the bottomless pit, and shut him up, and set a seal upon him, that he should deceive the nations no more, till the 1,000 years should be fulfilled. And after that he must be loosed a little season. And I saw thrones, and they sat upon them, and judgment was given unto them. And I saw the souls of them that were beheaded for the witness of Jesus and for the word of God, which had not worshipped the beast, neither his image, neither had received his mark in their foreheads or in their hands. And they lived and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. But the rest of the dead lived not again until the 1,000 years were finished. This is the first resurrection. So this passage is a main one from which we get the idea that there's going to be 1,000 years when something unusual is going to happen. Now, as I said, there are those who believe that during this 1,000 years, first of all, the God's people, the Christian church, is going to be taken away out of this world. They're going to be raptured away. And the world is going to be left with those who were not prepared for the coming of Jesus. They believe that during this time, a system of government will be set upon this earth, and God will go back to treating the Jews as his special chosen people. They believe that a system is going to be established where God will go back to dealing with the Jews and with the people who are here on the basis of the law. The system of the law is going to be reinstituted, inclusive of all the rituals and ceremonies of the law. And at that time, the Christians who are taken away from the world are going to be in heaven with Jesus in some kind of way, ruling over the people who remain on planet Earth. Then at the end of that 1,000 years, they believe Jesus will come back along with those who were raptured away, and he will set up an everlasting kingdom on this world. Now, the other point of view, is that Jesus is going to come again. And when he comes again, all who are Christians are going to be taken up with him. And all who are not Christians are going to be slain by the brightness of his coming. The earth is going to be left empty and desolate for 1,000 years. At the end of that, at this time, the Christians, those who are saved, will be in heaven with Jesus, living and reigning for that 1,000 years. At the end of that 1,000 years, Jesus will return to this planet along with those who were with him in heaven. Those who are dead, the wicked dead, will now come back to life. And at this point, Satan will begin to deceive the nations once more, because now these dead are alive again. And they're going to prepare for warfare. They're going to try to destroy Christ and those who came back to earth with him. And then there's going to be the final great judgment, and fire will destroy these wicked. So those are the two basic ideas. And I understand that there are many evidences that both sides can present. And I want to just first of all start by looking at certain principles before we look at the evidence. First of all, to talk about certain principles. First of all, the idea that God is going to go back to dealing with people on the basis of the law. The idea that he's going to go back to a system where the Jews once again become his special people. First of all, it's something that, as you understand the nature and the character of God, it does not seem to make sense. In my mind, it doesn't make sense. It suggests that God is a person who is inherently racially prejudiced. I know that he made promises to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I know he made promises, but you can't tie God to a promise as the basis for his behavior, because God does not make foolish promises. The promises that God makes are ultimately based upon God's character, God's nature, God's understanding of future events. This is clearly what I mean by this is when you look at God saying, for example, that Israel will never be cast off. Israel will never be cast off. If you go to Jeremiah 31, you find where God says that the sun would have to stop shining. The moon would have to stop giving its light. The waves of the sea would have to stop roaring before he would cast off Israel. God made that promise, but you find this promise is fulfilled because God changes his definition of Israel. Jesus says that Israel was cast off. He said, the kingdom of God shall be taken from you and given to a nation bringing forth the fruits thereof. He said to the Jews, behold, your house is left unto you desolate. Paul makes it clear in Romans chapter 2, verses 28 and 29, that the true Jew is the one who is a Jew in spirit, not the one who is a Jew in the flesh. So God made a promise, but when he made the promise, what he had in mind was spiritual Israel, not physical Israel. And his promises are like that. There are many promises that God makes that if you take them literal, they seem to be talking about somebody who is biased, who is racially prejudiced, somebody who is bound by statements that he has made. But when you understand them better, you realize that no, there's a deeper meaning to these promises. And when you understand what they are saying, it makes perfect sense. It harmonizes with God's character. And for me, the character of God is the bottom line. God has to be seen as fair and just, eminently reasonable. Everything that he does commends itself to our sense of fairness and justice. I am equal in the eyes of God to anybody who has ever lived. There's nobody who has an advantage over me because of race, because of the accident of where he was born. No. Ultimately, God is not like that. So, when God ended the system of dealing with the Jews, when God ended that system where Jerusalem was a holy place and where the system of the law was his way of government, it ended forever because it had served its purpose. And I don't believe there is any indication in the New Testament. There's no indication that this system was ever in itself of any value. And so was something that God would go back to. To go back to that, God is reversing himself. He's going back to something that, look at what the Bible says. For the law made nothing perfect. God is going to go back to something that never made anything perfect. According to this, well, I could say a lot, but let me just pause a second and see if there are any comments I need to pay attention to. I am going to come to the timeline in Revelation. I am going to come to Zechariah and other places. So don't worry, Brother Florian. I am going to touch on them. You know, I'm not suggesting that I'm going to be able to give a comprehensive study this evening, because a comprehensive study will take quite a bit of time. But I'm going to just touch on the main things. All right? So let's move on a little bit. I would like to look at what is this? Okay. Let's go to Revelation. Let's go back to Revelation 20 and look again at that passage that we just saw and highlight a few things here. Notice that the language in Revelation is very symbolic. It says an angel has a great chain in his hand, and he has the key of the bottomless pit. He binds Satan, he binds him for 1,000 years, and he casts him in the bottomless pit, and he sets a seal upon him that he should deceive the nations no more. Now, you ask yourself the question, is this a literal description of something that actually happens? Does an angel hold Satan, bind him with a chain, and throw him into a place called the bottomless pit? The language is figurative, and we have to understand the different elements. First of all, what is the bottomless pit? Let us notice a few things about the bottomless pit. It's used in Revelation a few places. Revelation 9, Revelation 11, Revelation 17, and here in Revelation 20, we see the bottomless pit coming up. To be consistent, we have to give the bottomless pit the same meaning in all the places where it appears. Let's look at what it says about in Revelation 17, for example. It says, the beast shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition. In Revelation 11 and verse 7, it talks about the beast from the bottomless pit killing the two witnesses. So wherever the bottomless pit is, that's where the beast comes from. When the beast appears again in his full strength, the beast is said to come from the bottomless pit. Now, does he come from a literal location, a pit that has no bottom? Or is it talking about something else? I'm going to suggest to you, and as I said, we don't have the time to look at everything this evening, but the phrase, the bottomless pit, is not speaking about a literal place. Revelation is a symbolic book, and many of the physical descriptions are to be understood in a spiritual way. What we are talking about is a spiritual condition which is referred to as the bottomless pit. My understanding is that if somebody is thrown into an abyss or a bottomless pit, it means that they have no hope. It's a condition of almost absolute despair. When this beast arises from the bottomless pit, what the Bible is telling us is that a condition is going to arise on this planet, a condition of utter godlessness, a condition where the Spirit of God has left mankind, and out of this state, this beast or this satanic kingdom is to re-emerge. So the beast is said to come from the bottomless pit. Now, I'm not going to talk about the beast, but I give you this because I want you to think about what the phrase, the bottomless pit, means. If you think it's a literal place, then you think Satan is going to be literally tied with a chain and thrown into a pit and kept there for 1,000 years. But that's not what the Bible is saying. If you think about the meaning of the bottomless pit as I just outlined it, what it means is that Satan is going to be bound by a chain of circumstances, not a literal chain. He's going to be placed in a condition where the Spirit of God is not present, where all evidence, where all manifestations of God's presence has totally been removed. In other words, he's going to be placed in a condition where there's nobody for him to tempt, where there's nothing for him to do but sit down and think about what he did in the previous 6,000 years. Now, what is going to cause this condition? The Bible describes it as an angel coming and binding him. But if you look at Revelation and how it is written, you'd be very foolish to think that this is a literal angel. In Revelation 14, it says, 3 angels fly through the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach to those who dwell on the earth. You know, it's not real angels. Angels have not been given the task of preaching the gospel. You find an angel in Revelation 8 who fills a vessel with fire from the altar, and he throws it to the earth. So, over and over, angels are used to represent situations that arise, circumstances that take place. So, what I'm suggesting is that when the angel is said to bind Satan, what really happens is that he's bound by circumstances, not by a literal chain, not by being thrown into a literal pit. The earth at this point in time has become what the Bible describes as a bottomless pit because the presence of God has been totally removed. Now, Jesus tells you in Matthew chapter 24. Let's see if we can find that verse and look at it. In Matthew chapter 24, Jesus tells us that I'll find it in just a moment. Yes, here it is. Jesus tells us, speaking about the signs of the end and his second coming, he says, immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So we have the promise there that God is going to, when Jesus comes again, there's going to be the great sound of a trumpet right after the tribulation of those days. Jesus will appear in the heaven, the tribes of the earth shall mourn. He will send his angels with a great sound, and they shall gather his elect from under heaven. Paul says something almost the same exact thing. If you look at 1 Thessalonians 4:16-17, it says, for the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trump of God, and the dead in Christ shall rise first. Then we which are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so shall we ever be with the Lord. So what we can see is that when Jesus comes again, all of God's people are going to be taken out of the earth. It says there's going to be the great sound of a trumpet. There's going to be a resurrection when the dead in Christ shall rise. And then we which remain, we, the remaining Christians, are going to be caught up together to meet the Lord in the air. So how many people, how many of God's people remain on earth at that time? The answer is zero. They're all gone. Jesus has sent his angels, and he has gathered together his elect from the four winds of heaven, from one end of heaven to the other. So nobody, none of God's people are left here. The only people left here are the wicked. But you ask the question, well, what about those who are not wicked? You know, the Jehovah's Witnesses say there are three classes. There are, well, they say four classes, right? They say there's the elect, and according to them, the elect are already in heaven. Then there's the righteous, which is Jehovah's people who live here. Then there is the unrighteous, which are they who have not had a chance to hear the gospel, but they are not wicked, neither are they righteous. And fourthly, there are the wicked. So they have four classes. But most people believe that there are basically three classes. There are the elect who are taken away, which is the Christian church. Then there are the Jews who will once again become God's favorite people. And then there's the rest of the world, those who are not ready for the coming of Jesus. But what we see here is that the Bible simply says that Jesus will gather together his elect, his people, from the four winds. If you're not among the elect, you're not among those who will be taken to heaven. Who will be left here? Definitely those who are not elect. And what will be their condition? Let's look again. And let's go back to the book of Revelation. And this time I want to look at Revelation, the last part of Revelation 19. Look at what it says down near the end of the passage. This passage speaks about the coming of Jesus. And it says in verse 17, and I saw an angel standing in the sun, and he cried with a loud voice, saying to all the fowls that fly in the midst of heaven, come and gather yourselves together unto the supper of the great God, that you may eat the flesh of kings and the flesh of captains, and so on. And it goes down to verse 19. And I saw the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies gathered together to make war against him that sat on the horse and against his army. And the beast was taken, and with him the false prophet that wrought miracles before him, with which he deceived them that had received the mark of the beast, them that worshipped his image. These both were cast alive into a lake of fire, burning with fire and brimstone. And the remnant were slain with the sword of him that sat upon the horse, which sword proceeded out of his mouth, and all the fowls were filled with their flesh. What we see here is that when Jesus comes again, the beast and the false prophet and all the remnant, all those who remain, are slain by the sword that comes out of his mouth. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, it talks about that wicked who will be destroyed by the brightness of his coming. And in the previous chapter, it's 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, it says the wicked shall be destroyed with flaming fire from the presence of the Lord. So what we see a sequence as we examine the Bible where Jesus comes again. He takes his people out of the earth, and those who remain are utterly destroyed. The earth is left empty. So the patterns that we see in the law begin to make sense, because every seventh year, what was supposed to happen to the land? Every seventh year, the land was supposed to be left. Nothing was to be planted. The field was not to be reaped. It was to be left to go to bush. Okay? Nothing was to happen. They were not to plant their fields. They were to leave it in the seventh year. In that seventh year, everything was to rest. The land was to be allowed to grow wild. Now, this could not be an illustration of the 1,000 years that many people believe will take place on this earth, because during that 1,000 years, according to their thinking, the earth is to be cultivated and the people are to learn righteousness and there's to be discipline and order. It would be a poor illustration to allow the land to go to wild bushes. What we see is that God's people are going to have a 1,000-year rest. They're going to have a Sabbath. And what is the Sabbath? The Sabbath is primarily time spent when man and God are face to face in a unique and special relationship. What we see is that during that 1,000 years, God takes his people away to live with him and to see his face and to be with him for that 1,000 years while the earth is left. Satan is left here with his angels to meditate on what he has been doing, while God's people are said to live and reign with Christ for 1,000 years. Now, the word reign causes some confusion, because people say, well, if they are going to reign, who are they going to rule over? But I think there's a misunderstanding. Even in eternity, it says that God's people are going to be kings and priests. And the earthly thinking is that, okay, if we are kings, we are going to have to rule over people. But is that really something that the Bible supports? Jesus says, that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and they that are great exercise authority upon them, but it shall not be so among you. He said, the greatest among you will be your servant. The idea of reigning is not so much an idea of having authority over other people. It's more the idea of having great privilege. For example, okay, I live in Jamaica. Most people Jamaica is considered a third world country, right? A lot of the amenities of the first world, a lot of people don't have running hot water. They don't, a lot of what you have in the first world, we don't have here. It's a third world country. But I'll tell you that in Jamaica, we live as kings compared to how people used to live 100 years ago, even in the most developed country. I mean, 100 years ago, if somebody wanted to go anywhere, they traveled by horse and buggy. If you wanted to travel from America to England, it took several months traveling by steamboat or whatever. Go back 200 years. The King of England, the greatest king in the world, never lived as comfortably as I live. I just turn a little tap, I get running water. When I go to the bathroom, every facility is there. I can turn a little switch and I have a fire to cook my dinner. I jump into my chariot and I drive off at 60, 80, 90 miles per hour. No king in the past ever had these privileges. So when the Bible says we reign with Christ, it's talking about privilege. It's not talking about authority. And when it says they will judge at that time, they will judge, I believe that this refers to the fact that during that time, these people who are with Christ in heaven, they have the privilege of examining what has been taking place on planet Earth. When Jesus comes back at the end of the 1,000 years, All who are alive, all who will come back to life, the rest of the dead who live not until 1,000 years are finished, they are going to come back to life. They are going to come back to face judgment. That judgment is not something that happens arbitrarily. First of all, there's an examination of the history of their lives. You can find it taking place in, you can find this kind of judgment taking place in other places, like in Revelation chapters 5 and 6, like in Daniel 7, verses 9 and 10. You find that there's a judgment that takes place. When Jesus comes again, it is to execute this judgment. But before the judgment is executed, the examination takes place. And who better qualified to take part in this examination than we who have lived on this earth? Now, those are some general reasons why I believe there is a millennium in heaven. I'll give you one more. I'll give you one more. The pattern of the Jewish feasts. And a lot of what we believe comes from the system of the law, how God set it up, and the types and the illustrations that were there. What he did was he gave the Jews 7 different feasts, 7 major feasts that they were to observe every year. And each one of these feasts represented a significant event in the plan of salvation, some significant thing that Christ would do in the plan of salvation. Let me just pause a minute and see if there's any, if I'm being heard, or if there's anything else that I need to. All right, so far it seems like the feed is okay. I don't see any complaints about the video or the audio. Yes, the 7 feasts of Israel. First of all, there was Passover, then there was Feast of Unleavened Bread, then there was Wave Sheaf or First Fruits, then there was Pentecost, then there was a blowing of trumpets, then there was a Day of Atonement, then there was a Feast of Tabernacles. Now, if you look at the first 4 feasts, okay, you find Passover was when Jesus died. The following day began the Feast of Unleavened Bread, when Jesus put away sin, when sin was put away from God's people, according to Daniel 9:24, according to Hebrews 9 and verse 26, according to Hebrews 10 and verse 14. Then the following day was the offering of the wave sheaf, or the first fruit, when Christ rose from the dead, went back to heaven, carrying some representatives of this earth with him, and he was accepted as the first fruits of the harvest of the earth. 50 days later was the day of Pentecost. The day of Pentecost was the time when the Holy Spirit came. And this leaves 3 festivals still to be fulfilled. Now, the first 4 that we mentioned was in the early part of the year, or in the spring. The next 3 took place in the 7th month. And again, you understand 7 is a symbol of completeness or perfection. In the 7th month, there was first of all to be a blowing of trumpets for 10 days. On the 10th day, there was to be the Day of Atonement, when all sin would be completely and finally taken away from God's people. 5 days later was supposed to be the Feast of Tabernacles. And God was very specific. This Feast of Tabernacles was to take place after the harvest of the land had been gathered in. It says the people were to leave their homes. They were to go out and to dwell in booths or in tents for 1 week. At that time, they would make little booths or little houses out of bush on the top of their houses. They would make it out in the bushes, and they would live for 1 week. They would wave palm branches before the Lord and rejoice before the Lord and praise and give him thanks. Now, the meaning of this should be very evident. The people left their homes. It means that during whatever this Feast of Tabernacles represents, during that time, God's people will not be at home. They're going to leave their homes. Wherever they go, they are going to be rejoicing and praising God, and they are going to be waving palm branches. Go to Revelation chapter 7, verses 9 and 10, and you will see a great multitude of people before the throne of God. And they are waving palm branches, and they are rejoicing before God. I believe that this is what it is talking about. It's a Feast of Tabernacles. They are in heaven. They are before the throne of God. They are worshiping God. They are waving palm branches. They are dressed in white robes. And they are saying, "Salvation to our God, which sitteth upon the throne, and unto the Lamb." So, these are some of the basic reasons why I believe the millennium won't be on this earth. But now, let me look at some of the problems that arise. Most of the problems that arise have to do with statements from the Old Testament. There are passages there that seem to suggest that there are many prophecies that still need to be fulfilled. And many people believe that these prophecies are going to be fulfilled during that 1,000 years on this earth, when once again God goes to dealing with the Jews as his special people, and things are going to return to that condition as they were during the time of the law. As I said, to me, that 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 makes so little sense. But it's not just that. I mean, the question of whether it makes sense to me is not the major issue at all, because maybe it's my mind that is just not seeing the thing the right way. But let's look at and see what the Bible teaches about it. Okay, the first principle I'd like to lay down is that in looking at the prophecies of the Old Testament, we have to understand how these prophecies were understood in the New Testament. You can't just take an Old Testament prophecy and just apply it like that. They were not intended to be understood in this way. And we can find very clear indications of this in the New Testament. Let me go to a passage in Amos, first of all. I'm going to start with a passage in Amos which illustrates what I'm trying to say. Okay? Amos 9 and verse 11. All right, let's start with Acts 15 and verse 16, right? This is during the time when they had that council of Jerusalem. And James, it says in verse 13, and after they had held their peace, James answered, saying, Men and brethren, hearken unto me. Simon hath declared how God at the first did visit the Gentiles to take out of them a people for his name, and to this agree the words of the prophets as it is written. After this I will return, and will build again the tabernacle of David which is fallen down, and I will build again the ruins thereof, and I will set it up, that the residue of men might seek after the Lord, and all the Gentiles upon whom my name is called, said the Lord, who doeth all these things. So, what we see here is that James uses a passage from the Old Testament. We're going to look at it in just a moment, but he uses this passage from the Old Testament, and he says, the fulfillment of this prophecy is how God has decided to take out from among the people, among the Gentiles, a people. Look at the words that James interprets in this way. It says, after this I will return and will build again the tabernacle of David. If you looked at this and took it literally, what you would think is that God is going to rebuild the Jewish temple. I will build again the ruins thereof and will set it up, that the residue of men might seek after the Lord, and all the Gentiles upon whom my name is called, said the Lord, who doeth all these things. So what this seems to suggest is that God was going to rebuild the Jewish temple. And then when that happened, the men who remained, the Gentiles, would seek the Lord. That's how James is interpreting this passage. Now let's look at the passage he's actually quoting from. It's Amos 9 and verse 11. Starting from verse 10, it says, all the sinners of my people shall die by the sword, which say that the evil shall not overtake nor prevent us. In that day I will raise up the tabernacle of David that is fallen, and close up the breaches thereof, and I will raise up his ruins, and I will build it as in the days of old, that they may possess the remnant of Edom, and of all the heathen which are called by my name, saith the Lord that doeth this. It's very interesting because nobody in his normal approach to the Bible would ever have interpreted Amos 9 in that way. Nobody. It took inspiration to interpret it in this way, because normally we can only go by context. But these apostles, these New Testament writers, they had a different approach to the scriptures. They understood that these Old Testament prophecies were not to be regarded in a literal way. And I'll tell you the reason why. Because the Old Testament is primarily dealing with type, illustration, and representation. Israel was a type of the true people of God, the church of God. Jerusalem was a type of Jerusalem above. The land of Canaan was a type of the new earth. Everything had a secondary meaning. And so they took these prophecies, which were written in literalistic language, and they applied them in the spiritual way. And I believe that if we don't understand this, a lot of the Old Testament is going to be very confusing for us. People always jump to the Old Testament, they take a passage and they interpret it and they say, this is for the future. But no, you have to apply it using New Testament principles. You have to understand that Israel is no longer the Jews. Israel is no longer the people who are genetically the descendants of Abraham. Israel is a spiritual people who have the faith that Abraham had. The promised land, as Paul says in Galatians chapter 4, Jerusalem, which is above, is the mother of us all. So we take those prophecies and we reinterpret them. We look for the spiritual application, not the literal application. This is generally true of most of the prophecies of the Old Testament. I'm not saying everyone. There are some like the prophecies in Daniel, for example, which are clearly operating on the basis of a definite coding system. They were not intended to be treated in the same way. But a lot of the other prophecies, you have to look at them with this careful examination, bearing these principles in mind. For example, in Isaiah 66, Isaiah 65, it says, for example, they shall build houses and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and eat the fruit thereof. Then it says, and the child shall die 100 years old, and the sinner being 100 years old shall be accursed. If you take it literally, what it means is that in the new earth, we are going to be building houses and children are going to die when they're 100 years old. But that's not what it is saying. What God is doing, he's giving them a picture of an ideal situation. What was to them a perfect situation? To them, perfection, to them, happiness, to them, their idea of heaven was a place where children did not die in infancy, where people lived as old as a tree, as the days of a tree, God says, shall be the days of my people. Long life, security from their enemies, prosperity. Everybody's crops are growing well. That's what they saw as the perfect situation. God gave it to them in their language. He says in Isaiah 66, verses 23 and 24, and it shall come to pass from one Sabbath to another, and from one new moon to another, shall all flesh come to worship before me. And of course, a lot of people say, see, we're going to keep the Sabbath in the new earth. And that I believe is true. But I would not use that verse, because the verse that follows say, and they shall go out to look upon the carcasses of the men that sinned against me. For their worm shall not die, and their fire shall not be quenched, but they shall be an abhorring unto all flesh. That verse says that on Sabbaths, we are going to use it as our pastime to go out and look at people roasting with worms eating them. They are going to be roasted and they cannot die, and it will be our Sabbath's entertainment. You can't take that literally. God is speaking of a system in which everything evil is going to be burned, and all that we consider good is going to be there. But he gives us in the language of the people that they could understand. We have to apply the spiritual meaning. We can't take it and just apply it literally. One of the passages, and I know I've been going on extra long this evening, but I'm going to look at a passage in Zechariah, because this is one of the main passages that is used to say that, the millennium is going to be spent here on earth. And if we look quickly at this passage, it's Zechariah 14. All right? Now, let me say at the beginning, my understanding is that this passage is really a panorama. It gives you a broad picture. But even then, it is still symbolic and figurative. It says in verse 2, I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle. And the city shall be taken, and the houses rifled, and the women ravished. The word ravished there means raped. And half of the city shall go forth into captivity, and the residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Now, if this is talking about the millennium, what it is saying is that during the 1,000 years, Jerusalem is going to be captured, and the houses are going to be robbed, and the women are going to be raped, and half of those who live there are going to become captives. Is that what is going to happen to God's people in the 1,000 years? I mean, that is crazy. Why would God allow something to happen to this? What would be the point? It says, then shall the Lord go forth and fight against those nations, and his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof toward the east and toward the west, and there shall be a very great valley, and half of the mountain shall remove toward the north, and half of it toward the south. Now, it goes on, and the whole passage is talking about this whole experience, but there are things here in verse 8, for example. It says, and it shall be in that day that living water shall go out of Jerusalem. The description of what happens makes you understand it's very symbolic. The Lord shall be king over all the earth. In that day there shall be one Lord, and his name one. Now look at what it says a little further down. In verse 12, and this shall be the plague wherewith the Lord will smite all the people that have fought against Jerusalem. Their flesh shall consume away while they stand upon their feet, and their eyes shall consume away in their holes, and their tongue shall consume away in their mouth. A little further. Verse 16. And it shall come to pass that every one that is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem shall even go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. Continuing. And it shall be that whoso will not come up of all the families of the earth unto Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, even upon them shall be no rain. So it says that in this perfect system, some people are going to have no rain. Verse 18, and if the family of Egypt go not up and come not, that have no rain, there shall be the plague wherewith the Lord shall smite the heathen that come not up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. So even the heathen, there will be heathen there. They're going to have to come and keep the Feast of Tabernacles, or they are going to suffer the plague. Then it goes on to say in verse 21, yea, every pot in Jerusalem and in Judah shall be holiness unto the Lord of hosts, and all they that sacrifice shall come and take of them and seethe therein. And in that day there shall be no more the Canaanite in the house of the Lord of hosts. Now, if we take this passage literally, some very strange things happen that really don't make any sense. For example, they're going to go back to offering sacrifices. Is God going to reintroduce such a system on the world after Jesus Christ is already dead? Is God going to accept animal sacrifices? Of course not. What we are seeing is a representation in the language and in the culture that the Jews understood. It was their system, it was their lifestyle, that's what they understood. God is giving them a picture, but it is highly symbolic. And even in this symbolism, all the events are jumbled together in a kind of panorama. You can't say the sequence is exact, nor can you say the pictures are exact. It says that there are going to be people there who are going to be suffering the plague because they don't come and keep the Feast of Tabernacles. It says that God's people, the women, are going to be raped. Why would God allow at any time, in a system of perfect peace, in a system where Jesus is ruling, why would he allow something like this to happen? Now I'm going to stop at this point because, as I said, a discussion of this issue is going to involve a lot more. But basically, these are the reasons, these are the basic reasons why I don't believe that the millennium is going to be on this earth. But it's going to be a time when God's people are taken out of the earth and will spend 1,000 years away from the earth. At the end of that time, they return here with Jesus. The wicked come back to life. And so Satan now begins to gather the wicked again for battle against Jesus and against those who have returned with him. And then they will be destroyed. So I'm going to stop at this time, and I want to thank you and express my appreciation that you were able to join with me. And I'm going to take the questions now. So let me see what we have and see if I can answer any of these questions. All right, the first question from Brother Florian. In Romans 11, Paul is clearly talking about the physical Jews and that they are blinded for our sake until Jesus returns. What is your opinion on hmm, what is your opinion on that? Are we blinded instead if we are the true Jews? No, I believe that here Paul is talking about the literal Jews. But what I believe is that we need to understand, we need to understand what he's really talking about. And I don't think we can, there are statements that Paul makes in that chapter, Romans 10 and verse 11 and chapter 11, which are not easy to follow because he says some things in one place and he qualifies it in another place. Paul was a Jew, and Paul believes that the Jews are going to be, they're not going to be abandoned and cast off forever as a people, as a group. He makes the point that has God cast off his people whom he foreknew? Then he says, no, I myself am a Jew. He's making the point that God has not cast the Jews off as a people because he himself, if God had cast the Jews away, then he could not be saved. So he's talking about God saving the Jews as individuals. He is the evidence that God is dealing with the Jews. But he suggests that sometime in the future, the eyes of many Jews, not the Jews as a nation, because God cannot go back to dealing with national Israel. If God does this, he's acting contrary to all the principles of the new covenant. What we would be suggesting, even Paul himself, what he would be suggesting is that God reverses the new covenant. And that is impossible because nowhere in the Bible does God ever reverse himself. When he leaves a system behind, he leaves it behind. The law made nothing perfect. Why would he go back to that? The first covenant, if that first covenant was faultless, then would he not have given us another covenant? There was a fault with the first covenant. Why would he go back to that? Why would he go back to a system of representations? Paul's meaning is that God is going to somehow awaken Jews. Do they have an advantage? Yes, they do. Why? Because to them we're given the oracles of God. They are the people who have a deep understanding of the law, and the law is what speaks of Jesus Christ. Somewhere, sometime, many Jews are going to awaken to what the law really means, and they are going to turn to Christ. This is what I believe Paul is talking about. And it may be that it coincides with a time when Gentiles in large measure, when we the Gentiles, or we the physical Gentiles, I would say, reject God or turn away from God. Maybe we are approaching such a time because right now, what used to be the Christian world is largely becoming an atheistic world. Much of Europe, much of America, much of what we call the Western world that was highly Christianized 100 years ago is now becoming very secular, godless. They no longer have any use for God. And it may be that at this time, the Jews will find an opening to accept the gospel. But the point I'm making is that Jews will never be saved as Jews. They will never be saved because they are Jews. Nobody will ever be saved in that way. They never were and they never will be. The only reason why anybody will be saved is because they accept Jesus Christ. So any turning around of the Jews has to be because they accept Jesus Christ. So it must be an acceptance on an individual level, not on a national level. That's the point I'm making. Florian says Zechariah 14 is before the 1,000 years, in my opinion, and not in the 1,000 years. Well, that makes it even worse because it suggests that people are going to be going back to offering animal sacrifices before the 1,000 years, and that Jesus is going to accept them as his people on that basis. And you know, God is going to go back to a system where the Gentiles must keep the Feast of Tabernacles before Jesus returns. I just find that absolutely something I could never accept. Why would God accept Feast of Tabernacles, animal sacrifices before the return of Jesus? Um, Keith says, but they shall be priests of God and of Christ and shall reign with him 1,000 years. Doesn't match with your definition. Well, what I don't know if you were there from the beginning, but what I said is that the idea of priesthood and the idea of reigning is something that we associate. We have certain preconceived ideas that we associate with reigning and with priesthood, which do not necessarily match up with all the biblical evidence. In this world, a priest offers sacrifice. Ultimately, in Malachi, we are told that the purpose of the priest is to carry good news. Most of us will remember in the Bible where when David's son died, Absalom, the Ahimaaz, who was the priest, wanted to carry the message to David. And Joab said, you shall not carry the message today because the king's son is dead. And Joab sent a man named Cushai instead. But Ahimaaz begged to go. And then finally Joab said, okay, go. And Ahimaaz took a shortcut and reached David before Cushai. And he said, my lord, good news. And the king says, what of the young man? Is he well? And Ahimaaz shut his mouth. He could not answer. He would not answer. And then when Cushai came, David asked, what about the young man? And Cushai said, he's dead. Why couldn't Ahimaaz answer the king? Because what many people don't realize is that the purpose of the priest is to carry good news. It's not just that he was to offer sacrifices. One of the major tasks of a priest was to carry good news. And this, for me, defines the purpose of the priests in all eternity. Why we are priests forever is that we will forever carry good news. We will be, of all the living things in the universe, we are the only ones who can speak from experience of the good news. We are the only ones who can tell angels and whoever else might live in the universe of what it is like to be redeemed. So forever we will be priests. Forever we will be God's representatives in the universe. It's not a question of mediating between God and others, as some people would think. Why would anybody need to be mediator between God and man in the years of eternity? Why would we need to be priests forever? But Jesus has made us kings and priests. And that priesthood and that kingship is not temporary. And so I believe it's the same thing with the kingship. We are kings in the sense that we have the privileges of kings, not in the sense that we rule over others. Because Jesus already told us that we don't rule over others. That's not how it is in his kingdom. Furthermore, he says, him that overcometh will I grant to sit with me in my throne. If all who overcome sit with Jesus in his throne, who are they going to be ruling over if that's what rulership means? Everybody who is saved is going to be sitting with him in his throne. In other words, we'll have a place in that kingship. So who do we rule over? We rule because we have the privileges of kings. We are kings because we have the privileges of kings, not because we rule over others. So that's how I understand that. Janos asked, doesn't reigning have to do with the judgment of the wicked? But I think I already touched on that in the presentation, so that's why I didn't actually go to that. Oh, there's an earlier question. Apart from Adventists, are there other groups of Christians who believe that the millennium is going to be in heaven while earth is left desolate? To be honest, I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know. I don't think I have met others who hold to that same belief. But then the thing is that I haven't really discussed the issue a lot with other people apart from Jehovah's Witnesses and I think Seventh-day Church of God, Armstrongites. I've discussed it with them, but I don't know what other Christians really believe. But I assume that most of them believe that the millennium is on earth. I want to say this as my final point. I want to encourage everybody to look at the pattern of the types that Jesus gave in the law. You know, I believe that this is one of the most important principles for understanding the purposes of God, for understanding the new covenant and how God is going to go about things. Look at the pattern of what happened in the law. Look at the pattern, like I suggested earlier on, Why was the land to be left to grow wild in the seventh year? Why? Why is it that at the Feast of Tabernacles, which is the last event in the Jewish calendar, the last event at in the Jewish feasts, why is it that the people were to leave their homes and dwell in temporary homes? Why was it that while they did this, they were to wave palm branches? And the only place you see that happening is in Revelation 7 and verse 10, when they are in heaven before the throne of God. Those are questions I'd like us to consider, because I think the pattern of the Jewish system is probably one of the clearest evidences that we could use. All right, thanks, Janos. Thanks for that comment about dispensationalism. And I think you are probably right. And probably, as you said, we need to talk about it another time, because, yes, you're right. If God deals with people and saves people differently in different ages, if God has different ways of saving people in different ages, then yes, it does support the idea of an earthly millennium. But if God has only one plan and everything else was illustration or type, focusing on that one single great plan, then it might help to explain some of the discrepancies. All right, I accept that and I agree with that, and I thank you for the comment. Thank you everyone for joining me. If we don't fully agree with everything, then at least I want to encourage you to study a little bit more. If there are questions, then next week, then I will try to respond to those questions. Thanks very much for joining me. I just want to say that the week after, not next week, the week following, we're not going to have a broadcast, because I'm going to be leaving the island, and I'll actually be leaving that day, so I won't be able to broadcast. I don't know if I'll be able to broadcast the following week, because I'll still be out of the island, but I'll try if I can from where I am. I don't think I can do that either, because I think I'm going to be in the air at this time as well. So after next week, we're going to have the broadcast next week. Then there will be a 2-week break, and then we'll return. Thanks very much. God bless you all. Keith, I hear you. Zechariah 14 is talking about what will happen when Christ comes. All right. Well, I get the point. I get what you're saying. I still believe that Zechariah 14 is highly symbolic, highly symbolic. And if we're going to discuss it, I would like somebody to explain to me, what does it mean that people go back to offering sacrifices? What does it mean that the women are going to be raped? What does it mean that those who don't come up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles are going to suffer a certain plague, and no rain is going to fall on them? Give me a clear timeline for when these things will happen. And even when you do, we still have to operate on the basis of the principles of interpretation which we obtain in the New Testament. I leave it there. Thank you all very much, and God bless you, and I see you next week.